The topic is finance as barrier to addressing systemic climate change. I am going to say mea culpa. I've read economics, but I've come to realize that it is the paradigm that's preventing me from looking at the issues as a whole. Okay. Let me put it this way. Until 2008, having worked all my life on banking and finance, I thought I understood money. After 2008, the central bank started changing all my concepts of how to look at this. And then in the last 2 years, I finally realized we're in deep trouble. Okay. And that's because the paradigm of economics is basically based on classical physics and Newtonian mechanical mode, whereas the natural scientists have moved onwards to biology, etc., and economics have retained in the old world. And as Capra and Luisi have said, we're all interrelated, we're all entangled, and how do we deal with this? Now the Chinese say man and nature are one. Okay. And of course, Einstein says we can't solve the problems of the world unless we change our thinking. And therefore, the biggest barrier is not just physical, but mental. Now, what mental barriers are these? I had to go back to Karl Popper. The old world thought everything was physical. There are physical limits. Money was tied to gold. If there's no gold, money value, cannot be increased. That was the 1920s crisis. They invented finance, and bank lending was included in money. So Karl Popper said, well, the second world is the mental world. So you have a physical world and a mental world. But the mental world is a product of human imagination. And human imagination is infinite. So there are limits to physical and unlimited to our imagination. And we have created all the products of human mind, language, culture, institutions, etc. And then suddenly, we discovered that if we can print money in excess, we can consume in excess. If we can consume in excess, we can consume the earth in excess. And that's the big problem that we have now. So if everyone consumed, like the average American or even a European, 4 earths are necessary. What is finance? Finance has printed 10 times the amount of GDP in gross, in financial terms. We are continuing to do this. Okay, we're continuing to do this. And the reason is money represents power. If I can give you pieces of power, pieces of paper, which can depreciate and get physical resources from you and your services in blood, sweat, and tears, I'm more powerful than you. And so, it's become part of the geopolitical domination issues. Now, this is the real trouble. As our friend Piketty says, if the rate of growth of wealth is greater than the rate of GDP, inequality is happening. And inequality is happening big time. And how big time is this? Before 2008, central banking assets were probably around $12 trillion. Today, they are larger than pension funds, insurance funds, and mutual funds. Just this 2020 alone, they created 8 trillion. What is 8 trillion? 8 trillion is 10% of world GDP. Created just like that with no cost, no constraints, right? And they're doing it because we need to save the world. But what has happened? The highest percentage of the 1% of the population has, according to Oxfam, earned far more than the bottom 40% of the population, which has become worse after the COVID. So, the society's inequality has become unsustainable. And the trouble is that 1%, as we all know, is controlling the media, controlling the paradigm, and that's a serious problem. So we actually have a global liquidity trap. At the present moment, the liquidity of the world is so great, right? It's all trapped within the Wall Street, including London, Europe, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Singapore markets. Basically, it's literally trapped there, right? And they're looking for investments, But at the strange time, the socially SDG investments, which is supposed to be 2.5 trillion annually, is compared with this 8 trillion that the central banks can print overnight, but there is hardly any lending long term. So you have a huge demand for infrastructure, spending on health, on urbanization, on food, on prevention. None of it's going all there. It's all going at lent at zero or negative rates to be funding speculation, and stock markets are higher than ever, even though profits are hugely dividing and the bottom half of society is really totally stressed. And why is all this? Central bankers have brought interest rates, which was supposed to be the constraint on the creation of money, down to zero. And the solutions to social change, climate change, is about carbon trading, and more green finance. But we know from the experience of the last 10 years, a lot of the carbon trading and green finance benefits the rich and the online crowd, and literally has very little, connection with what's happening in the real world. So the trouble is that the current financial system is unequal. It's very quantitative. It's predatory. It's unsustainable. It's very sad to say this, but I'm a central banker, and I'm ashamed of that the way that we have completely ignored the moral issues by still printing money with no comment on where we're going to put that money, etc. So to a large extent, this is the strange part, right? For most of our careers, right, living memory, money was scarce. Today, money is not a constraint to buying time for climate change, but mindset is. And so, as long as there is excess capacity, and there's huge excess capacity of unemployment because of the economic recession, there is very likelihood that, very little likelihood, short run, that monetary creation will engender inflation. So having removed that, why is it that most developing countries and advanced countries can't invest in infrastructure? Answer: politics, right? For various reasons, what is very obvious cannot be delivered because of collective action traps, right? But there is a collective action trap mainly because politics try to reconcile conflicts, okay, and vested interests that engender, as we have now seen in the American elections, 50% of the population is not listening to reason. There's anger out there. And if you cannot persuade everybody, what happens to policies? Policies overpromise and underperform, resulting in huge distrust of the elites, because the elites have failed the masses. And you can call them deplorables or populists, but they have a legitimate voice, which we are not giving them. And so what the result is that if we do see that man and nature are one, science and arts are one, right? Markets and state and civil society are one, right? And therefore, the paradigm is to actually get out of this silo mentality, which says it's always the other's problem, okay? And economics has failed to price, as presentation after presentation. We don't consider, the externalities. And if we can't quantify the externalities, we don't price them in. And even if we price them in, we can create a market to sort this out. And as you know, creating that market only benefits those who know how to benefit, and you don't get the change. So, to a large extent, I have come to the conclusion that the economics, the mainstream economics, I'm not saying that all economists, think like that, having become, as Keynes said, taught by professors of the 30s, right, have now so much dominated our paradigm that we can't think out of the framework which enables us to get out of this collective action trap. And so, money is not an issue. The question is, how do we change the mindset on this issue? And I think that's a very big question that we can leave for everybody else to discuss later. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrew. I have a question from Simon Sadek. He says, Andrew, in the past you have made the case that the global debt equity balance is wrong and that there must be a greater focus on equity in real assets. Is this still part of how you see things in the wider context of your argument?
Absolutely. You know, when I came back to Malaysia, I got involved in Islamic finance. And I finally understood Islamic finance. Islamic finance is about risk sharing, and debt finance is about risk transfer. You know, the risk transfer means that you transfer all the burden of the risk to the borrower. And if the borrower cannot pay, you send him to jail, right? But if the borrower owes you $2 billion, you don't go to jail. You know, the shareholder that pays for it, and the central bank prints more money to clean up your bad loans. So, you know, we literally have very problematic gaming of finance, okay? What is equity? Equity means that if I put money in you and you lose money, I lose money. So actually it's extremely fair, right? It's extremely fair. But look at global capital markets, stock markets. I used to regulate them. There are only 50,000 companies. How many SMEs are there out in the world? More than 200 million. Do they get access to listed companies, to listing on the stock exchange? Zero, okay? Almost impossible to get, right? Because you have to go to an investment banker, you have to hire very expensive accountants. The whole elite feeds out of this trough of creating money in which when they fail, the central bankers bail them out. This is the crime of the century. And, you know, I mean, as a central banker, I'm ashamed to be part of this, you know, but this feeding is still going on. And so, you know, if we are able to shift more to equity, and then we realize that the return on equity could be negative because we're betting on the people. But if the masses getting what they need, and we've seen through the lending to women, lending to the poor, the returns are actually not bad at all. In fact, the social returns are not bad at all, right? But the myth out there is you must price that risk, and you must price that risk into your lending rate so that, you know, the lending rate for energy transformation for emerging markets is today 10 to 15% per annum compared to zero or negative in the advanced markets, you know, for emerging markets. So, but the result is chicken and egg. If you don't put in the infrastructure, you know, the poor keeps on getting poorer. We can't solve a lot of the problems, right? So, you know, there's a huge moral issue now in moral hazard. We seriously, you know, we really need to think out of this current paradigm, and an organic one, a situation in which we understand we are part of the whole, that your problem is my problem, and we are all entangled. All this is fully understood in natural sciences now, in biological sciences. The issue of emergence, you know, the issue of chaos, the issue of, you know, order, right, and you know, sort of entanglement. But for economists, sorry, if it doesn't comply mathematically to my neoclassical model, you're not even counted. How many external journals have tried to break through this and can't get through? So to me, as an economist, we are in the Reformation. You know, the cardinals of mainstream neoclassical are so entrenched that if there is no mathematical model, it needs to be rejected. The paper needs to be rejected. And the result is, you know, we have this very poorly understood neoclassical model feeding into the policymakers' models that don't give them good solutions. And in fact, solutions that are not just bad, you know, they are very damaging.
Very good. There's a question that is from Ekirumira. I hope I pronounce it right. How do your arguments pick on perhaps not mainstream complexity economic ideas that propose a non-equilibrium view of the economy?
Well, Sir Martin would know Keynes tried in the 1936 to argue against equilibrium. And he said, you get into a liquidity trap, and only government can get you out of this. And then, of course, the neoclassic Chicago school and sort of came back with a vengeance and said, no, government is not a solution. It's the problem. And today, the market is the problem, okay? The reality is that both are needed. In fact, on top of that, civil society is needed. And as somebody said earlier, it's not a 2 out of 3. It's actually all 3 are needed to get to a solution, okay? We've been so transfixed about equilibrium that we will revert back to equilibrium. This is nonsense. The neoclassical model is an exception, not universal, right? And on the pretense that you have a pretense of knowledge, even Hayek argued against this. Don't have a pretense of knowledge. Don't pretend that you know what you don't know. And the answer is, when he said that, the market is self-order, but he doesn't really, but Hayek himself would have acknowledged that huge bureaucracies have self-order, right? Right. So the result is that we are in a new paradigm of non-equilibrium, and if we accept the non-equilibrium, that there are not just non-equilibrium but multiple equilibriums, not one equilibrium, then the policy thinking would be much better. So to a large extent, I'm on the Commission on Global Economic Transformation, and a number of us went to see the Pope, and the Pope's Laudato Si suddenly woke me up, because he said, you economists talk about as if you can price everything, you forget morality. And that's absolutely right. With interest rate at 0, everything is Islamic finance. There's no usury anymore at interest rates 0, right? But all that money goes to that 1%, which is hugely unequal, okay? So the result is the price of money at 0 or negative is no longer an efficient allocator of resources. That part is extremely clear. But where does that put us? It put us, whoever the politician is, says where the money should go, it's going, irrespective of the huge waste that is going on. Let me give you an illustration, right? As you know, the United States has just given $1.9 trillion in helping the poor. And I totally understand this. A very well-to-do friend of mine, who is 1% of the population, has just received $2,800 government check, for which they don't need at all. So that's how bad the system has become, all right? Okay, money not for what is needed. We have a complex situation of the ancient mariner, liquidity, money, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. And that's happening to 80% of the population who need that liquidity but can't get it.
There's one last question for you, Andrew, that is from Jan Staman. Could this oversized financial elites disempower and disintegrate or finish this nation state?
I don't think the nation state will go away. Neither will cardinals change their religion or even their stance. Having spent all their time becoming cardinals, and I mean cardinals in every profession, they will not give up their fundamental beliefs. Okay? And when that fundamental paradigm is challenged by the masses now, every man for himself. Sorry about this, but that's the reality. But actually, we can have collective action. I mean, I think the collective action trap is again to a large extent, historically, human society have found the answer, but is not necessarily found by the elite. Ultimately, it's found by the masses, strangely enough.